The snow crunches beneath the boots of German soldiers as they examine something unexpected on the frozen ground of the Tunisian desert in early 1943. What they find in the abandoned Allied position appears deceptively simple: a metal tube, roughly 5 feet long, with basic sights and a crude shoulder rest. Yet this captured weapon will alter the balance of armoured warfare on the Eastern Front and become one of the most feared anti-tank weapons in the German arsenal. This is the story of how American ingenuity met German engineering, how desperation bred innovation, and how a weapon called the Bazooka crossed enemy lines to return as the Panzerschreck, the terror of tanks. To understand this remarkable tale of technological borrowing and military adaptation, we must journey back to a time when the German war machine appears unstoppable, when massive steel tanks roll across Europe seemingly without equal, and when the soldiers who face these armoured beasts possess few weapons capable of stopping them. But the tide of war shifts not just through grand strategies and massive battles. Sometimes, history pivots on something as simple as a metal tube and the desperate ingenuity it inspires. The story begins not in the deserts of North Africa or the frozen steppes of Russia, but in the laboratories and proving grounds of the United States in the late 1930s. American weapons designers face a persistent problem that has plagued infantry forces since the first tanks rumbled across the battlefields of the Great War. How can a single soldier, or a small team of soldiers, effectively combat an armoured vehicle without requiring artillery support or anti-tank guns that take precious time to position and crew? Lieutenant Edward Uhl and Captain Leslie Skinner of the United States Army work tirelessly on this problem. The challenge seems insurmountable. Any weapon powerful enough to penetrate tank armour requires either a large caliber that produces devastating recoil, or it needs to be so heavy that mobility becomes impossible. The existing anti-tank rifles, which saw service in the First World War and the early days of the Second, already prove inadequate against modern armour. Tank plating grows thicker with each new design, while anti-tank rifles reach the practical limits of what a human being can carry and fire. But Skinner and Uhl pursue a different approach entirely. They explore the possibility of using shaped charge technology, a concept that relies on the focused explosive power of a specially designed warhead to penetrate armour. The principle behind shaped charges represents one of the most remarkable discoveries in weapons technology. When an explosive charge is shaped correctly, typically with a cone or hemisphere carved into it and lined with metal, the resulting explosion focuses into a jet of superheated metal that can pierce armour far thicker than conventional explosives could ever manage. The shaped charge concept itself dates back to the late 19th century, when an American scientist named Charles Munro discovers that the shape and orientation of an explosive charge dramatically affects the pattern of its force. But it takes decades for weapons designers to fully understand and harness this principle. By the late 1930s, both American and German researchers independently develop practical shaped charge warheads, though neither side fully realizes what the other has achieved. Uhl and Skinner recognize that a shaped charge warhead solves half the problem. Such a warhead can be relatively lightweight compared to the armor penetration it achieves. But the question remains, how do you deliver this warhead to the target? A soldier cannot simply throw it like a grenade and expect to damage a tank. The warhead needs velocity, accuracy, and range. It needs, in effect, a delivery system. The breakthrough comes in May of 1942. Uhl, working at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, experiments with placing a shaped charge warhead onto a rocket motor. Rockets offer several advantages. They are relatively simple. They eliminate recoil because the exhaust gases vent backward, and they can be fired from a lightweight launcher. But rockets also present challenges. They tend to be inaccurate, and the backblast from a rocket powerful enough to deliver a useful warhead can be dangerous to the operator. Uhl solves these problems with elegant simplicity. He creates a launcher from a length of steel tubing that allows the rocket to vent its exhaust safely behind the shooter. He adds simple iron sights. He designs a basic shoulder rest and hand grips. The entire assembly weighs just over 13 pounds. The rocket itself, tipped with a shaped charge warhead capable of penetrating several inches of armor plate, becomes the M6. The launcher becomes the M1. Together, they form the M1 rocket launcher, though soldiers quickly give it another name entirely. The name Bazooka comes from a comedic musical instrument played by Bob Burns, a popular radio comedian of the era. Burns plays a crude horn made from pipes and a funnel, which he calls his bazooka. When soldiers first see the M1 rocket launcher, they immediately notice the resemblance to Burns's instrument, and the nickname sticks. The War Department never officially adopts the name, but soldiers, reporters, and eventually the entire world knows the weapon as the bazooka. The bazooka enters American service in 1942. It deploys first with American forces preparing for Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, in November of that year. The weapon represents a revolutionary step forward in infantry anti-tank capability. For the first time, a two-man team carrying a relatively lightweight weapon can pose a genuine threat to even heavily armoured tanks, provided they can get close enough and aim well enough to make their shots count. The North African campaign becomes the proving ground for this new weapon. As American forces land in Morocco and Algeria in November 1942, they carry with them thousands of bazookas. The weapon sees its first combat use in the confused fighting that follows the landings, as American troops encounter both Vichy French forces and, soon after, German and Italian units rushing to counter the Allied invasion. The bazooka performs adequately against lighter armoured vehicles and proves particularly effective against fortified positions, where its shaped charge warhead can blast through stone and concrete. But the weapon also reveals limitations. Its effective range barely extends beyond 100 yards, and even at that distance, accuracy proves challenging. The rocket's relatively slow velocity means that hitting a moving target requires both skill and luck. The early M6 rockets also suffer from reliability issues, with some failing to detonate on impact. Yet, despite these limitations, the bazooka represents a significant leap forward in portable anti-tank firepower. German intelligence officers take note of this new American weapon almost immediately. Reports begin filtering back to Berlin about a tube-launched rocket weapon that infantry carries into battle. But reports alone cannot convey the true nature of the device. The German army needs to examine an actual specimen. That opportunity comes in early 1943, during the fierce fighting in Tunisia. The exact date and location remain somewhat unclear in historical records, obscured by the chaos of combat and the passage of time. But at some point during the winter or early spring of 1943, German forces overrun an American position and discover several intact bazookas among the captured equipment. This capture proves to be one of those small moments that ripple through history with unexpected consequences. The Germans immediately recognize the significance of what they have found. Here, in these simple tubes and rockets, lies a solution to one of their own most pressing tactical problems, though from the opposite perspective. While the Americans designed the bazooka to help infantry fight German tanks, the Germans now see in this weapon a solution to fighting Soviet tanks, which by 1943 have become a formidable threat on the Eastern Front. The captured bazookas make their way quickly through German intelligence channels. Units in the field conduct immediate field testing, firing captured rockets at abandoned vehicles and fortifications to assess the weapon's capabilities. Intelligence officers photograph and measure every component. Technical drawings are prepared. And then, most importantly, the specimens are sent back to Germany for thorough evaluation. To understand why the Germans react with such interest to the captured bazooka, we must turn our attention to the Eastern Front, where by early 1943, the German army finds itself in an increasingly desperate struggle against Soviet armoured forces that have grown both in number and in capability. When Germany invades the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Wehrmacht possesses what most observers consider to be the finest armoured force in the world. German tanks, though not always superior in armour or armament to their Soviet counterparts, benefit from superior tactics, better training, and the advantage of surprise. The early months of Operation Barbarossa see staggering Soviet losses. Thousands of Soviet tanks fall victim to German panzers anti-tank guns, and even infantry weapons. But the Soviets prove remarkably resilient. More importantly, they prove remarkably capable of learning and adapting. By late 1941, new Soviet tank designs begin appearing on the battlefield that shock German tank crews and infantry alike. The T-34 medium tank and the KV-1 heavy tank possess armor that German standard anti-tank weapons struggle to penetrate. The 37mm anti-tank guns that proved adequate against lighter Soviet tanks in the early weeks of the invasion bounce shells harmlessly off the sloped armor of the T-34. German infantry anti-tank weapons in 1941 and 42 consist primarily of anti-tank rifles and various types of grenades and explosive charges. The anti-tank rifles, particularly the Panzerschreck 38 and 39, can penetrate about 20 millimeters of armor under ideal conditions. This proves barely adequate against the sides and rear of a T-34 and utterly insufficient against its frontal armor or the heavy armor of a KV tank. As for grenades and explosive charges, they require infantry to approach extremely close to an enemy tank, a proposition that usually proves suicidal in the face of supporting enemy infantry and the tank's own machine guns. The Germans do possess some specialized infantry anti-tank weapons. The Panzerfaust, a single-shot, disposable-shaped charge weapon, begins development in 1942, but does not enter widespread service until 1943. The Panzerfaust proves effective, but suffers from extremely short range, typically requiring the user to be within 30 meters or less of the target. This limitation means that using a Panzerfaust often becomes a suicide mission, especially in open terrain, where approaching tanks enjoy long fields of fire. By the time German forces capture the Bazooka in Tunisia, the situation on the Eastern Front has grown even more dire. The Battle of Stalingrad, which ends in February 1943, results in catastrophic German losses. The Soviets not only destroy the German Sixth Army, but also demonstrate improved tactical proficiency and overwhelming numerical superiority in armor. German generals studying the situation realize that their forces need better infantry, anti-tank weapons, and they need them immediately. The captured Bazooka appears to offer a solution. Here is a weapon that provides meaningful range, substantially more than the Panzerfaust in its early variants. Here is a weapon that can be reloaded and reused, unlike the disposable Panzerfaust. Here is a weapon that delivers a shaped charge warhead with penetration characteristics superior to existing anti-tank rifles. Moreover, and perhaps most importantly from a German perspective, here is a weapon that already exists in functional form. The Germans do not need to develop a novel concept or work through years of trial and error. They can simply copy what the Americans have already created, perhaps with improvements based on their own extensive experience with both armor and anti-armor weapons. The German examination of the captured Bazooka takes place at multiple locations. Field units in North Africa conduct initial assessments. Then, the weapons travel to testing facilities in Germany, where engineers subject them to exhaustive evaluation. The Germans fire the captured rockets at various types of armor, plate. They measure the penetration achieved under different conditions. They disassemble the launcher and the rockets to understand every aspect of their construction. They analyze the metallurgy of the components. They study the propellant used in the rocket motor and the explosive filling in the warhead. What the German engineers discover impresses them. The American weapon, while not without flaws, demonstrates sound engineering principles and adequate performance. The shaped charge warhead can penetrate approximately 80 millimeters of armor plate under optimal conditions, sufficient to threaten most tanks in service in 1943 if the shot strikes at the right angle. The rocket stabilization through simple fins proves adequate for engagement, ranges out to about 150 meters. The launcher itself represents a masterpiece of simplicity, requiring minimal manufacturing resources and easily produced even by less sophisticated workshops. But the German engineers also identify areas where they believe improvements can be made. They note that the American rocket uses a 2.36-inch diameter, which seems somewhat arbitrary from a German perspective. German industry works primarily in metric measurements, and adopting an inch-based caliber would complicate production unnecessarily. More importantly, the German engineers believe that a larger diameter rocket could carry a more powerful warhead and achieve better armor penetration, addressing the threat posed by heavily armored Soviet tanks. The decision-makers at the German Army Ordnance Office move with remarkable speed. By spring of 1943, they issue specifications for a German version of the captured American weapon. The new weapon will use an 88mm caliber, chosen both for compatibility with German manufacturing standards and to accommodate a larger shaped charge warhead. The launcher will be somewhat longer than the American original, to stabilize the term, larger rocket, and the entire system will be optimized for the specific tactical requirements of the Eastern Front, where engagement ranges tend to be longer than in the close terrain of North African wadis or European towns. The development work falls to multiple German firms, but much of the detailed engineering takes place at the facilities of companies already experienced in rocket and explosive technology. The shaped charge warhead draws on German expertise in this area, which parallels American developments. German researchers have been working on shaped charge technology independently, and they apply this knowledge to create a warhead optimized for the larger 88mm diameter. The rocket motor requires careful design. It must provide adequate velocity to the projectile without creating excessive blast that might injure the operator. The Germans experiment with different propellant formulations and nozzle designs. They conduct test firings, measuring velocity, accuracy, and backblast characteristics. They discover, as the Americans did before them, that the rocket's exhaust creates a significant flash and cloud of smoke that reveals the shooter's position. This vulnerability cannot be entirely eliminated without fundamentally changing the weapon's operating principle, so the Germans accept it as an inherent limitation. The launcher tube itself presents fewer challenges. German industry possesses extensive experience in manufacturing, steel tubing, and producing the launcher requires no particularly exotic materials or processes. The Germans design simple iron sights, similar to those on the American original. They add a shoulder rest and hand grips. They include a basic trigger mechanism to fire the electrical igniter that starts the rocket motor. One significant issue emerges during testing that will define the weapon's subsequent development. The larger 88mm rocket produces substantially more backblast than the American 2.36-inch version. More problematically, the rocket motor's exhaust, when fired in an enclosed space or in very cold weather, generates dangerous fumes. Several test firers experience what the Germans clinically describe as toxic effects from the exhaust gases. In at least one case during early testing, an operator suffers serious injury from the backblast and fumes combined. This problem leads to one of the most distinctive features of the German weapon. The designers add a protective shield at the front of the launcher, intended to protect the operator's face from the initial blast of rocket exhaust and toxic fumes that can blow forward in certain wind conditions. This shield, combined with the weapon's overall appearance and devastating effect on enemy armor, eventually inspires the weapon's German nickname, Panzerschreck, meaning tank's terror or tank's fright. Initially, however, the Germans designate the weapon more prosaically as the Raketenpanzerbüchse 54, literally Rocket Armor Rifle 54, or RPZB 54. The numerical designation refers to the weapon's overall length of 154 centimeters, following German convention of incorporating key measurements into nomenclature. But soldiers, who care little for official designations, quickly adopt the more evocative Panzerschreck, and this name enters common usage among both German troops and their enemies. By autumn of 1943, German factories begin producing the Panzerschreck in quantity. The weapon's relatively simple construction means that it can be manufactured in workshops throughout Germany, even as Allied bombing campaigns begin to disrupt more sophisticated production programs. The launcher requires no precision machining. The rockets, while more complex, still use conventional explosives and propellants that German industry produces in large quantities for artillery shells and other munitions. The German army prioritizes deployment of the Panzerschreck to units fighting on the Eastern Front, where Soviet armored offensives pose the greatest immediate threat. Infantry divisions receive allocations of the new weapon, typically organized into specialized anti-tank squads within each infantry company. Training emphasizes the weapon's capabilities and limitations. Soldiers learn that effective engagement range extends from about 50 meters to roughly 150 meters, with accuracy falling off rapidly beyond that distance. They learn to aim for the sides and rear of enemy tanks, where armor tends to be thinner. They learn about the danger of the backblast and the critical importance of ensuring no one stands behind the weapon when it fires. The first combat uses of the Panzerschreck occur in late 1943, as German forces attempt to stem Soviet offensives following the disastrous German defeat at the Battle of Kursk. Soviet tank formations, emboldened by their growing numerical superiority and improving tactical skill, press attacks along multiple sectors of the Eastern Front. German infantry, now armed with Panzerschrecks in addition to Panzerfausts and conventional anti-tank guns, find that they possess a somewhat improved ability to engage Soviet armor at useful ranges. Combat reports from this period reveal both the weapon's effectiveness and its limitations. When Panzerschreck teams can establish good firing positions and engage Soviet tanks at optimal range, they achieve impressive results. The 88mm shaped charge warhead proves capable of penetrating the armor of T-34 seconds and even the heavier Soviet tanks when shots strike at favorable angles. The psychological effect on Soviet tank crews also proves significant. The knowledge that German infantry now possess effective anti-tank weapons at ranges beyond hand grenade distance makes Soviet tankers more cautious, sometimes slowing advances or forcing tanks to move more carefully in areas where German infantry might be concealed. But the Panzerschreck also suffers from significant ITOT drawbacks in actual combat. The weapon's backblast and smoke signature make it almost suicidal to fire more than once or twice from the same position. Soviet infantry and supporting tanks quickly learn to watch for the distinctive flash and smoke cloud of a Panzerschreck firing, and they respond with concentrated fire. The weapon's accuracy proves challenging at ranges beyond 100 meters, and many rockets miss their targets entirely, particularly when engaging moving tanks. The weight of the launcher and rockets, while manageable for a two-man team, still limits mobility. Each rocket weighs about 3 kilograms, meaning that a team can carry only a limited load of ammunition before becoming too burdened to move effectively in combat. Moreover, the Panzerschreck shares with the Bazooka a fundamental vulnerability that shaped charge weapons of this era cannot overcome. The rocket travels relatively slowly, with a muzzle velocity of only about 110 meters per second. This slow speed means that hitting a moving target at any distance requires the shooter to lead the target significantly. Many combat reports describe frustrated Panzerschreck teams watching their rockets pass harmlessly behind fast-moving Soviet tanks, the delay between firing and impact allowing the tank to drive past the impact point. Weather conditions also affect the weapon's performance. Rain can damage the electrical firing mechanism. Extreme cold affects the rocket propellant's burn rate and can cause failures to fire. Mud and dirt can foul the simple sights or obstruct the launcher tube. The protective shield at the front of the launcher, while necessary to protect the operator from backblast, also collects moisture and can become difficult to see through in rain or snow. Despite these limitations, the Panzerschreck becomes one of the most widely produced German infantry anti-tank weapons of the war. Estimates suggest that German factories manufacture over 100,000 launchers and well over 2 million rockets between 1943 and the end of the war in May 1945. These numbers, while imprecise due to incomplete German records and the chaos of the war's final months, indicate the importance the German military places on the weapon. The Germans do not simply copy the American bazooka and leave the design unchanged. Throughout 1944, German engineers work on improvements to address the problems identified in combat. The most significant modification results in a new variant designated the RPZB 54/1, and later the Panzerschreck 8.8 cm Raketen Panzerbuchse 43. The primary improvement in this newer version involves eliminating the protective blast shield. This might seem counterintuitive, as the shield protects the operator from the rocket's toxic exhaust. But combat experience reveals that the shield adds weight and bulk to the weapon, making it more cumbersome in the field. Moreover, German chemists develop an improved propellant formulation that produces fewer toxic fumes. With this new propellant, the blast shield becomes less necessary. Removing it saves about 3 kilograms of weight, making the weapon more portable. The Germans also experiment with different warhead designs throughout the production run. Earlier rockets use a straightforward shaped charge configuration. Later versions incorporate improved liner materials and optimized cone angles to enhance penetration. Some variants receive impact fuses that prove more reliable than earlier designs. The Germans develop armor-piercing incendiary variants for use against fortifications and lighter vehicles. They even produce a few experimental rockets with wire guidance systems, though these never enter mass production due to their complexity and cost. Ammunition production becomes a constant challenge as the war situation deteriorates for Germany. The Panzerschreck rockets require high explosives, copper, for the shaped charge liner, steel for the body, and various propellant chemicals. All of these materials become increasingly scarce as Allied bombing campaigns disrupt German industry, and as Germany loses access to foreign sources of raw materials. By late 1944, the quality of Panzerschreck ammunition begins to suffer noticeably. Some rockets fail to fire, others detonate prematurely. The shaped charge liners in later production rockets sometimes use inferior materials that reduce penetration performance. Despite these production challenges, the Panzerschreck remains in frontline service until the final days of the war. German units fighting in the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 employ Panzerschrecks against American tanks. German defenders in Berlin in April and May 1945 use Panzerschrecks in desperate attempts to stop Soviet armor advancing through the city streets. Even Volkssturm units, the poorly trained militia formations, raised from old men and boys in the war's final months, receive allocation of Panzerschrecks, though whether these hastily trained civilians can use them effectively remains doubtful. The Germans develop detailed tactical doctrine for employing the Panzerschreck in combat. Training manuals emphasize the importance of careful position selection. Panzerschreck teams should occupy concealed positions with good fields of fire toward likely enemy tank approach routes. They should have multiple firing positions prepared, knowing that they must move immediately after firing to avoid return fire. They should coordinate with other anti-tank weapons, including Panzerfausts for close-range defense and anti-tank guns for long-range engagement, creating layered defenses that force enemy tanks into kill zones. The typical Panzerschreck team consists of 2 soldiers. The gunner carries the launcher and is responsible for aiming and firing. The loader carries the rockets and loads them into the rear of the launcher. In practice, teams often operate with 3 or even 4 soldiers, allowing them to carry more ammunition and to rotate roles as fatigue sets in during prolonged engagements. The extra team members can also provide security, watching for enemy infantry, while the gunner focuses on tracking an armored target. German tactical doctrine stresses patience. Panzerschreck teams should wait for optimal firing opportunities rather than engaging at extreme range or against poor targets. A side shot against a tank's thinner armor offers much better chance of penetration than a frontal shot against heavy armor. A stationary or slow-moving tank provides a much easier target than one at full speed. The doctrine acknowledges that Panzerschreck teams might have to let some tanks pass unmolested while waiting for better opportunities. The psychological burden on Panzerschreck teams proves considerable. Operating an anti-tank weapon in the face of advancing enemy armor requires extraordinary courage. Tank crews possess multiple means of retaliating against infantry anti-tank teams: main guns firing high-explosive shells, machine guns, and supporting infantry. A Panzerschreck team that reveals its position by firing becomes an immediate target for overwhelming firepower. Many German soldiers assigned to anti-tank duties view it as nearly suicidal, particularly in the war's later stages, when German forces find themselves consistently outnumbered and outgunned. Just as the Germans captured and copied the American Bazooka, Allied forces capture large numbers of Panzerschrecks as they advance into German-held territory from both east and west. Soviet forces capture thousands of Panzerschrecks during their massive offensives in 1944 and 45. American and British forces overrun German positions in France, Italy, and eventually Germany itself, taking possession of substantial stocks of Panzerschrecks and ammunition. Allied intelligence officers examine these captured weapons with great interest. They recognize, often with some irony, that the Germans have essentially returned the bazooka's technology to its source, enlarged and modified. Technical intelligence reports note the improvements the Germans made: the larger caliber, the simplified design in later models, the variations in warhead configuration. These reports feed back into American and British weapons development programs. The Soviets, in particular, find the Panzerschreck of significant interest. Soviet forces begin using captured Panzerschrecks against their former owners, finding them useful for the same reasons the Germans did. They provide infantry with portable anti-tank capability at useful ranges. More significantly, Soviet weapons designers study the captured Panzerschrecks carefully. While the Soviets develop their own series of anti-tank weapons independently, including the RPG series that eventually becomes ubiquitous in Cold War conflicts, the German Panzerschreck influences aspects of this development. American forces, having seen their bazooka design reflected back at them in enlarged German form, take the lesson to heart. The United States continues to develop and improve the bazooka concept throughout the remainder of World War II and into the Korean War. The Super Bazooka, a 3.5-inch variant developed in the late 1940s, shows clear influence from examination of captured Panzerschrecks. It uses a larger diameter to accommodate a more powerful warhead, directly paralleling the German decision to upsize from the American 2.36-inch original. How effective was the Panzerschreck in actual combat? This question proves surprisingly difficult to answer with precision. German record-keeping deteriorated badly as the war situation worsened, and units in contact with the enemy rarely had time to file detailed after-action reports. Soviet records from the period, while extensive, do not always clearly distinguish between tank losses from different German anti-tank weapons. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that the Panzerschreck achieved some significant successes while also suffering from substantial limitations. The weapon gave German infantry a fighting chance against Soviet armor at ranges beyond the near-suicidal distances required for Panzerfaust employment. When used by well-trained troops operating from prepared positions, Panzerschrecks could and did destroy Soviet tanks. The psychological effect of the weapon, forcing Soviet tank crews to move more cautiously in areas where German infantry might be concealed, may have been as important as the actual tanks destroyed. However, the Panzerschreck could not fundamentally alter the trajectory of the war. By the time the weapon entered widespread service in late 1943 and early 1944, Germany had already lost the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. No infantry anti-tank weapon, no matter how effective, could compensate for Germany's deteriorating situation. Shrinking manpower reserves, collapsing industrial production under Allied bombing, catastrophic fuel shortages, and the relentless advance of numerically superior Allied forces from both east and west. Moreover, the Panzerschreck's effectiveness was limited by the training and morale of the troops using it. In the hands of experienced soldiers fighting from well-prepared positions, the weapon posed a genuine threat. But as Germany's military situation deteriorated, more and more Panzerschrecks found their way into the hands of poorly trained Volkssturm militia, rear echelon troops pressed into frontline service, or adolescent boys drafted into the Hitler Youth. These soldiers often lacked the training, experience, and sometimes the will to use the weapon effectively under the terrifying stress of facing advancing enemy armor. The Panzerschreck also suffered from a fundamental problem shared by all infantry anti-tank weapons of the era. To be effective, The user had to be brave enough, or perhaps desperate enough, to allow enemy tanks to approach within range before firing. This requirement meant that Panzerschreck teams often found themselves in situations of extreme danger, facing not just the tanks they targeted, but also enemy artillery, infantry, and supporting weapons. The casualty rate among German anti-tank teams in the war's final year was catastrophically high. The story of the Bazooka and Panzerschreck illustrates several broader themes in the history of weapons development and military technology. First, it demonstrates that even enemies locked in total war continue to learn from each other. The Germans did not hesitate to copy an American design when that design offered advantages. Pride and ideology took a back seat to practical military necessity. This pattern of copying and adaptation appears throughout military history, from ancient times to the present day. Second, the story shows how technological advantages can be short-lived. The United States introduced the bazooka as a novel weapon, offering American infantry new capabilities. Within months, the Germans not only copied the weapon, but arguably improved upon it with their larger caliber Panzerschreck. The Americans then studied captured Panzerschrecks and incorporated lessons into their own subsequent designs. This cycle of innovation, copying, and counter-innovation accelerates dramatically during wartime when the stakes are highest. Third, the development of the Panzerschreck reveals the importance of industrial and resource factors in weapons production. The weapon's simple design allowed Germany to continue producing it, even as Allied bombing devastated more sophisticated production programs. The choice of an 88mm caliber, while partly driven by performance considerations, also reflected the practical reality that German industry worked in metric measurements. These practical industrial considerations often matter as much as theoretical performance in determining which weapons actually reach the battlefield in significant numbers. Fourth, the story illustrates the limits of technology in warfare. The Panzerschreck was a reasonably effective weapon within its design parameters, but it could not overcome Germany's fundamental strategic problems. It could not compensate for the massive numerical superiority that Soviet and Western Allied forces enjoyed by 1944. It could not reverse the loss of air superiority that left German ground forces vulnerable to Allied air attack. It could not overcome the fuel shortages that increasingly immobilized German armored forces. Weapons, no matter how innovative or effective, operate within a broader context of strategy, logistics, economics, and morale. The Panzerschreck ceased to be a frontline weapon with Germany's surrender in May 1945, unlike some German weapons that saw extensive post-war service. With various armies around the world, the Panzerschreck largely disappeared from active use. The few specimens that survived found homes in museums or private collections, becoming historical artifacts rather than active weapons. But the concept behind the Panzerschreck lived on. The idea of a shoulder-fired, reloadable rocket launcher capable of defeating armored vehicles proved so useful that virtually every major military force developed similar weapons. The American Super Bazooka served through the Korean War. The Soviets developed the RPG-2 and later the iconic RPG-7, which remains in widespread use more than 60 years after its introduction. Modern anti-tank weapons, from the Swedish Carl Gustaf to the American Javelin, trace their conceptual lineage back through the Panzerschreck and Bazooka to those early experiments with shaped charges and rocket propulsion. The Panzerschreck also occupies an interesting position in the mythology and memory of World War II. In popular culture, German weapons often receive portrayal as brutally efficient and technologically advanced. The Panzerschreck fits this image. A weapon born from captured technology, but enlarged and improved, reflecting German engineering prowess. Yet this popular image obscures a more complex reality. The Panzerschreck was neither revolutionary nor uniquely German in conception. It was a copy, though an intelligently modified one, produced out of desperate necessity as Germany's military situation deteriorated. As we reflect on this story of a weapon that crossed battle lines and returned transformed, we are reminded that war, for all its horror and tragedy, often serves as a crucible for rapid technological change. The Panzerschreck's development from captured bazooka to frontline German weapon took less than a year, a remarkably short timeline that would be impossible in peacetime. We are also reminded that innovation in warfare is rarely the product of a single genius or a single nation working in isolation. The bazooka drew on shaped charge research that occurred simultaneously in multiple countries. The Panzerschreck combined American design concepts with German manufacturing and tactical requirements. Later weapons built on this foundation, incorporating lessons from both designs. Military technology advances through a complex process of innovation, observation, copying, and adaptation that transcends national boundaries, even in the midst of conflict. The soldiers who carried bazookas into North African wadis, or Panzerschrecks, into the frozen battlefields of the Eastern Front, probably gave little thought to the weapon's historical significance. For them, these devices represented tools of survival, means of fighting back against enemy armor, desperate hopes of living through another day of combat. The rockets they fired traveled only a few hundred meters before impact. But the ideas embodied in these weapons traveled much farther, shaping the development of infantry anti-tank warfare for generations to come. In the end, the story of the Panzerschreck is not really about a weapon at all. It is about human ingenuity under pressure, about the ways that necessity drives innovation, about how ideas transcend the boundaries of war and ideology. It is about how a simple metal tube, captured in the desert and transformed in German workshops, became part of the vast and terrible machinery of the Second World War. And it is about how this transformation, born from conflict and desperation, left a legacy that extends far beyond the particular battles and campaigns where these weapons saw service, influencing military technology into our own time. The battlefields where Panzerschrecks fired their last shots have long since fallen silent. The soldiers who carried these weapons, on both sides, have mostly passed into history. But the fundamental challenge they faced, how to give infantry effective means of combating armor, remains relevant, wherever soldiers and tanks face each other in combat. In this sense, the Panzerschreck and its American ancestor live on, not as museum pieces, but as steps in an ongoing evolution of military technology that began long before 1943 and continues to this day.